The smell hit Claire first. Not the rot, not yet. That would come later, creeping in like an unwanted guest, insidious and unstoppable. It was the sweetness of glazed ham going stale under the antique chandelier, the sour tang of wine left too long in crystal glasses that had been in the Holloway family for 100 years, the heavy musk of bodies that hadn't moved in 72 hours. She sat at the long mahogany table in the Holloway dining room, her hands trembling against the white linen tablecloth that Diane had ironed that morning with the same mechanical precision she did everything, and watched Marcus cut another piece of turkey with movements that looked almost robotic. His eyes were glassy, focused on nothing, or perhaps on everything and nothing all at once. The knife scraped against the china with a sound that made Claire's teeth ache. Across from her, his mother Diane lifted a fork to her lips with the slow, dream-like movement of someone underwater, someone drowning in inches. At the head of the table, in the carved oak chair that had belonged to Holloway's for 5 generations, brought over from the estate sale in Charleston in 1873, sat the body of Thomas Holloway Sr. His head was tilted slightly to the left, his mouth open in a final exhale that had come 3 days ago, on Sunday afternoon between the ham and the sweet potato casserole. A fly landed on his liver-spotted hand. No one moved to brush it away. Claire watched it crawl across his knuckles, and she thought distantly that this was the moment she would remember when she went mad. If she wasn't mad already. Claire had arrived at the estate on a Thursday afternoon in late November, when the Georgia pines still held on to their green like a secret, and the air carried the burnt sugar smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. She'd been dating Marcus for 8 months, long enough to meet the family but not long enough to understand them, not long enough to see the warning signs that had probably been there all along. The drive from Atlanta had taken 3 hours, winding through small towns that seemed frozen in amber, past churches with hand-painted signs promising salvation and gas stations with single pumps that looked like relics from another era. Marcus had been quiet the whole way, his knuckles white on the steering wheel of his black sedan, his jaw clenched in a way that should have alarmed her. "They're traditional," he'd said finally, as they turned onto the long gravel drive that cut through acres of cultivated woods, perfectly manicured to look wild. "My family, they have their ways of doing things, their rules." Claire had smiled, squeezed his hand, felt the tension in his fingers. She'd grown up in Chicago, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where her mother worked double shifts at the hospital, and dinner was whoever grabbed a cereal first, or heated up whatever leftovers existed in the back of the refrigerator. The idea of tradition, of legacy, of family dinners that meant something seemed quaint, charming even, romantic in a way her own childhood had never been. "I'm sure they're lovely," she'd said, watching the house come into view through the tunnel of trees. "I can't wait to meet them." The house rose from the landscape like something out of a Gothic novel, like something that had grown there rather than been built. White columns that gleamed in the afternoon sun, black shutters that looked like closed eyes, a wraparound porch that seemed to go on forever, circling the entire structure like a mourning band. The windows reflected the sky in a way that made them look blind. Marcus's younger sister, Evelyn, had greeted them at the door before they'd even made it up the steps, as if she'd been watching for them. Her smile was bright and her handshake firm, practiced. She was 25, blonde, perfectly composed in a cream-colored dress that looked like it cost more than Claire's monthly rent. Her makeup was flawless, her hair twisted into an elaborate updo that must have taken an hour. "You must be exhausted," Evelyn had said, her accent thick as honey, sweet and cloying. "Such a long drive. Marcus, take her things up to the guest room. Claire, dinner's at 7 sharp. Don't be late. Grandfather doesn't like to wait." The emphasis on that last sentence had been slight but unmistakable. Claire had noticed it, filed it away, but hadn't understood. Not then. The guest room had been on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with portraits of dead Holloways. Men with stern faces and women with sad eyes, all of them watching Claire as she walked past. The room itself was beautiful in an oppressive way. A 4-poster bed with a lace canopy, wallpaper with tiny roses that seemed to move in Claire's peripheral vision. A view of the gardens that stretched out behind the house in geometric precision. "It's beautiful," Claire had said, because it was expected. Marcus had set down her suitcase and immediately checked his watch. "We have 45 minutes. You should change. They dress for dinner." "How dressed are we talking?" "Very." The first dinner had been on Thursday night. Claire had changed into the nicest dress she'd brought. A navy sheath that had seemed appropriate for meeting the boyfriend's parents, but suddenly felt too short, too urban, too much like she was trying too hard. The dining room was enormous, lit by a chandelier that must have held 50 candles, all of them real, all of them casting dancing shadows on oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to be watching the table with disapproval. The table could have seated 20 easily, a vast expanse of dark wood polished to a mirror shine, but there were only 6 of them. Marcus's parents, Diane and Thomas Jr., sat on either side of the grandfather like sentinels or prisoners. Evelyn sat next to Claire, close enough that their elbows nearly touched, and Marcus positioned himself across from her, creating a strange symmetry that felt deliberate. Thomas Sr. sat at the head of the table in that carved chair, elevated slightly above the others, a small, wizened man who looked like he'd been folded in on himself by time and gravity. He had to be 90, at least, possibly older. His hand shook as he lifted his spoon, liver spots covering the papery skin, and his eyes, when they found Claire, were sharp and calculating and utterly without warmth. "So, you're the one," he'd said, his voice a rasp like wind through dead grass, like something that had forgotten how to be human. "Marcus's girl from the city, the one he thinks is good enough for this family." Claire had felt her stomach tighten. "Yes, sir, it's an honor to meet you." He'd grunted, a sound that could have meant anything or nothing, and returned his attention to his soup. The family had begun eating in silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware against china and the low tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down to something Claire couldn't name. She'd watched them for a moment, trying to gauge the atmosphere, then reached for her water glass. She was thirsty from the drive, her throat dry. Evelyn's hand had shot out, gripping Claire's wrist before her fingers could touch the glass. The touch was gentle but firm, unyielding. "Wait," Evelyn had whispered, leaning close enough that Claire could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral. "Grandfather hasn't finished his soup." Claire had frozen, confused. She'd glanced at Marcus, but he was staring at his plate, jaw tight, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Around the table, everyone sat motionless, waiting, like statues or like people who'd forgotten how to move. It took Thomas Sr. 15 minutes to finish that soup, each spoonful a laborious journey from bowl to mouth, trembling the whole way, occasionally missing and dripping back into the bowl. Only when he'd set down his spoon with a decisive click, a sound like a gavel, did the others resume. The relief around the table was palpable, like everyone had been holding their breath. The Sunday dinner rule, Diane had explained later when Claire had pulled her aside in the powder room, needing to escape, needing to understand. The bathroom was all marble and gold fixtures, mirrors that showed Claire how out of place she looked. No one leaves the table until grandfather finishes. It's been that way since Thomas was a boy, since his father and his father before him. Goes back to the founding of this house. The eldest eats at his own pace and the family waits. It teaches patience, respect, proper order. But what if someone needs to use the restroom? Claire had asked, thinking of her bladder, already complaining after that first course. Or has an emergency. You wait, Diane had said simply. Her smile was pleasant, practiced, but her eyes were hard as stones. You learn to anticipate, to prepare. You'll get used to it. We all did. It's really not so bad once you understand it's for the family's good. But her hands, Claire noticed, were shaking. Friday's dinner had lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. Claire knew because she'd watched the grandfather clock, mesmerized by its slow torture. Thomas Sr. had eaten with agonizing slowness, pausing between bites to stare into the middle distance, his mind somewhere else entirely, perhaps in a past where he'd been the one waiting. Claire's bladder had screamed, her legs had cramped, her back had ached from sitting so still and so straight. But she'd waited. She'd watched Marcus's father pour himself glass after glass of wine, watched his hand grow less steady with each pour, watched Evelyn's perfect posture never waver, even as sweat beaded on her forehead, watched Marcus sit rigid as stone, barely breathing. When they'd finally been released, when the old man had finished and they could leave the table, Claire had practically run to the bathroom. She'd sat there afterward, hands shaking, trying to understand what she was experiencing. This wasn't a charming tradition. This was something else. Something is wrong. But when she tried to talk to Marcus about it that night in the guest room, he just shrugged. "It's always been this way," he'd said. "You get used to it." What if I don't want to get used to it? He'd looked at her then, really looked at her. And she'd seen something in his eyes that might have been pity or might have been warning. "Then you probably shouldn't marry me." It was the first time marriage had been mentioned between them. The word hung in the air like a threat. Saturday had been worse. The turkey had been dry by the time they'd finished, the mashed potatoes cold and congealed, the gravy forming a skin. Claire's stomach had churned with hunger and confusion, and something that was starting to feel like fear. This wasn't normal, this wasn't healthy. But every time she'd tried to catch Marcus's eye, to communicate her discomfort, he'd looked away. And she'd noticed something else. The family never spoke during dinner, not once. Only the sounds of eating, of waiting, of the clock ticking. Sunday dinner had started at noon sharp, a full spread, a feast that belonged on magazine covers or in history books. Ham studded with cloves, glistening with honey glaze, sweet potatoes topped with pecans and brown sugar, green beans glistening with butter and almond slivers, rolls that steamed when broken open and smelled like heaven, 3 kinds of pie waiting on the sideboard. The preparation must have taken Diane and Evelyn hours. Claire had offered to help that morning and been politely but firmly refused. "We have our way of doing things," Diane had said. And that was that. The grandfather had taken his first bite of ham at 12:15. Claire had noted the time, already calculating how long this might take. He'd chewed slowly, deliberately, his jaw working like rusted machinery. Then his hand had dropped. Just dropped, like someone had cut the strings. The fork had clattered against the plate, a sound shockingly loud in the silence. His head had tilted to the left, slowly, and a soft wheeze had escaped his throat, air leaving a punctured tire. And then nothing. No movement, no breath. Claire had started to stand, her chair scraping back against the hardwood floor, the sound like a scream. "He's having a stroke, we need to call." But Marcus's hand had shot out and grabbed her arm. His grip was bruising, desperate. "Sit down. He's dying. We need to call an ambulance. We need..." "Sit down." His voice had been sharp, commanding, terrified. Thomas Jr. had stood slowly, methodically, walked to his father's side with the measured pace of a funeral march. He'd placed 2 fingers against the old man's neck, held them there for a long moment while everyone watched. When he'd returned to his seat, his face was gray, ashen, the color of someone who'd seen the end of the world. "Grandfather is finished eating," Diane had said quietly, her voice eerily calm, practiced. "We may eat now." Claire had stared at them, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. "He's dead. Your father is dead. We need to call someone, an ambulance, the police, a doctor, someone." "He died at the table," Evelyn had said, her voice eerily calm, matter of fact. "During Sunday dinner, the rule still applies." "What rule? He's dead." "He's dead, and you're just sitting here like nothing happened." Marcus had leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, his voice barely a whisper. "No one leaves the table until he's finished eating." "But he'll never finish," Claire had whispered back, horror dawning. "He's dead. Dead people don't eat." Exactly. That single word had contained multitudes. Understanding crashed over Claire like a wave. They meant to stay. They meant to sit here at this table with the body until, what? Forever? That had been Sunday afternoon. Now it was Wednesday morning, nearly noon, and Claire was beginning to understand that she was trapped in something beyond tradition, beyond eccentricity, beyond anything her rational mind could process. This was madness given structure. Horror dressed up as heritage, a curse masquerading as custom. They'd been eating for 4 days straight. Not continuously, Marcus had explained during his first sleep shift, but in rotations. Someone was always at the table. Always. Marcus's father had developed a system within the first 6 hours, a rotation. 6 hours on, sitting at the table, maintaining the vigil. 2 hours to sleep in the sitting room, never upstairs, never far from the dining room. Then back to the table. They ate what was left of Sunday's feast, then cold cuts brought up from the kitchen by whoever was on sleeping rotation, then bread and cheese, then crackers, then whatever they could find. The food was running low. No one mentioned it. No one mentioned anything that mattered. The body had begun to change on Monday. Thomas Sr.'s skin had taken on a waxy quality, like candles left in the sun, and his lips had pulled back from his teeth in a permanent grimace that might have been his final expression, or might have been death's work. The smell had started Monday night. subtle at first, easy to ignore or explain away. By Tuesday, it was unmistakable despite the cold November air they'd let in through the windows. Claire had vomited twice, once in her napkin, which she'd hidden in her lap like a guilty secret, and once in a crystal bowl that had held cranberry sauce. No one had reacted. No one seemed to care. "Why are you doing this?" she'd asked Marcus during his sleep shift on Tuesday, when she'd found him curled on the velvet sofa in the sitting room, shaking like he had a fever. "This is insane. We can't just sit here with his body. There are laws, health codes, basic human decency, common sense." "You don't understand," Marcus had said, his voice hollow, empty. "When I was 7, my uncle tried to leave, Uncle Richard. He stood up before grandfather finished his soup. We all heard the rule break. It was like glass shattering, like the world cracking. Uncle Richard made it to the door before he collapsed, heart attack, dead at 42, healthy as a horse the day before. That's a coincidence. Correlation isn't causation. It was probably stress, or... My cousin tried when she was 16. Marcus had continued as if she hadn't spoken. Jennifer, smart girl, full scholarship to Vanderbilt. She stood up, walked out, got in her car, made it 2 miles down the road. They said she drove straight into a tree, never even touched the brakes. Like she aimed for it. Like something made her do it. Claire had backed away slowly, her skin crawling. "You're telling me this rule is... what, cursed? Magical? That's not real. Curses aren't real, magic isn't real." "I don't know what it is," Marcus had said, and for the first time she'd seen tears in his eyes, cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "But I know what happens to people who break it. And I know that if grandfather died at the table, then we stay until he finishes. He's never going to finish, he's dead." "I know," Marcus had whispered. "I know." Wednesday afternoon, Diane had started talking to her dead father-in-law. Gentle conversation about the weather, about the price of soybeans, about the new minister at the church, about nothing at all and everything that didn't matter. Her eyes were bright with fever or madness. Claire couldn't tell which. Thomas Jr. sat silent, hadn't spoken in 24 hours, just stared at his plate and occasionally lifted food to his mouth with mechanical precision. Evelyn had begun to hum, a tuneless sound that set Claire's teeth on edge and made her want to scream. Claire had tried to leave twice. The first time, Tuesday night, she'd made it as far as pushing her chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. The pain had hit immediately. It felt like her chest was being crushed, like invisible hands were squeezing her heart, stopping her blood. She'd gasped, collapsed back into the chair, and the pressure had released immediately, like someone had flipped a switch. The second time, Wednesday morning, she'd forced herself to stand, to take 3 steps toward the door, driven by desperation and fury. The pain had been worse, blinding, white-hot, and she tasted copper in her mouth, felt blood trickle from her nose. Marcus had caught her before she hit the floor, carried her back to her seat like a child. "I told you," he'd whispered, his voice breaking. "The rule doesn't let go." By Thursday morning, Claire understood with absolute certainty that she was going to die in this room. They all were. The food was almost gone. They were eating moldy bread now, scraping the last of the butter from its dish with their fingers. Diane had stopped talking. Thomas Jr.'s hands trembled constantly, and he'd developed a tic, his head jerking to the left every few seconds. Evelyn's humming had become a scream that she swallowed back down every few minutes, her throat working. And at the head of the table, Thomas Sr. sat in his chair, his body slowly decomposing, turning into something that wasn't human anymore, his final meal incomplete on the plate before him. The fly had been joined by others. They crawled across his face now. Still, no one moved to brush them away. Claire looked at Marcus, really looked at him. Saw the boy who'd grown up in this house, who'd learned to wait, to obey, to fear something he couldn't name or fight or escape. She'd thought she was visiting a family for Thanksgiving weekend. She'd been wrong. She'd walked into a trap that had been set generations ago, a rule that had calcified into something monstrous and alive and hungry. "There has to be a way," she said, her voice cracked and dry, barely recognizable as her own. "Some loophole, some way to satisfy the rule without staying here forever, without dying here." "My great-grandfather tried that," Evelyn said suddenly. Her voice sounded strange, like she'd forgotten how to use it, like she was speaking a foreign language. "Fed a grandfather his last bite himself. Thought that would count as finishing. Grandfather choked on it. Great-grandfather dropped dead before he could even call for help. Heart attack. The rule knows. The rule always knows what you're trying to do." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the table, across the body, across all of them. A rat had found its way into the dining room, drawn by the smell of decay. It sat on the sideboard, bold as brass, watching them with bright, knowing eyes. No one moved to chase it away. They didn't have the energy. They didn't have anything left. Claire thought about her mother, about her small apartment in Chicago, about the life she'd had before she'd driven down that gravel road lined with watching trees. She thought about all the meals she'd eaten alone, rushed, standing over the sink because she was too tired to sit. She'd envied Marcus, his family, his roots, his tradition, his sense of belonging to something bigger than himself. She'd been such a fool. As the sun set on Thursday evening, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise, Claire sat at the table with her hands folded in her lap like a prayer or a surrender, her eyes on the grandfather's corpse, and waited for whatever came next. Death, probably. Madness, certainly. The rule held them all in its grip, patient and implacable as death itself, as time itself. And at the head of the table, Thomas Holloway Sr. sat in eternal judgment. His meal unfinished, his family bound to him forever by a tradition that had become their tomb, their prison, their hell. The chandelier flickered, candles guttering. The rat squeaked, a sound almost like laughter. And in the silence that followed, Claire heard what might have been laughter or might have been the wind through the Georgia pines, old and cold and satisfied with its harvest.
The scripted casebook remains open. Subscribe to the archive. Share the evidence. Leave your verdict below. Some secrets are better shared.